Okay. Yes, Watson? Yeah? What's going on? Yeah? Okay. Give people another minute or two to show up. Yeah? Kim? What's up? Okay. So if you haven't already, go ahead and pull up the code labs. And we're going to go into 9.2. So as kind of an overview of what's in the 9.2 labs, there's two different programs here. The first one is called App with Settings, and we're just going to start with a very simple one screen activity. We're just going to start with the basic activity template and add a very, very simple setting screen to it. The next thing we'll do is we'll go back to your Droid Cafe app, basically, that you built a while ago, except we'll be building on a starter project so that we're all starting from the same place. And we're going to add a settings menu to that one as well. Time permitting, I would actually like to go back to the lab we did for 9.1 and add a settings menu to that one too, because I think that will kind of maybe help with some of the questions that were had about 9.1, as well as seeing a more practical application of how to pull some of this stuff together. So the plan is to do that. We might go back and do the 9.1 lab tomorrow, depending on where we land for time. But I do want to try to get through both of these today, so we can finish up the stuff that's here specifically designed for 9.2. Okay, so let's start with that. All right, so here's the app that we're going to end up creating. We've got a main screen that's got just hello world in it. And then within there, you'll see that there's that triple dot there, which is going to bring up the options menu, and all that's going to have in it is the settings, a link to the settings page. And then this is our settings page. It's just going to have a simple switch. That's it. We're just going through how to get the basics up and running. Okay, so that's where we're going to start. So I'm going to jump over to task 1. Okay, so in task 1, it's going to ask us to create a new project. Okay, so I'm going to go into Android Studio and I'm going to create the new project with those settings. Okay, so it's going to tell us to create it with a basic activity. So I'm going to do that here. And then I'm going to call this application app with settings. And I need to put this somewhere else because I've already created this one. All right, so go in here, projects. So I'm going to call that folder app with settings live. Okay, that's that. And we're going to go ahead and hit finish. So the important thing there is that we created it with the name app with settings, and that we created it with a basic activity template. If you didn't create it with a basic activity template, then you're going to have a problem with where we're at, because you're going to have to add the menu, whereas the menu is already there. Not a big deal, but just to stay on pace, that will help. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and hit run on this, get it running on the emulator. Okay, so I've got just the basic activity started. If it's still taking a minute to get that project running, you can just pause it here and then we'll resume with the next part, but I'm going to keep going just because we're on a bit of a time constraint at the moment. So what I want to do, now that I've got that basic activity, is I'm going to go down here and we're going to start looking at the steps. So run the app, we'll notice that there's a settings menu here. If I click on that, it doesn't actually do anything. So I need to fix that. I need to make it actually do something. So in order to make that happen, I first need to go into res here, the one that doesn't say generated. So I'm going to right click on that. I'm going to say new Android resource directory. Okay. And we're going to call this the XML. We're going to call this XML. So you pick that from the drop down. It's going to change the directory name to XML. I'm going to go ahead and create that. Okay, so now I have an XML directory there. And then inside of there, I want to create my preferences.xml file. So I'm going to right click this. I'm going to say new. I'm going to see new XML resource file. And we're going to call this preferences.xml. Okay. I'm going to go ahead and hit OK. Yes, I would like to add that to source control. And if I look at the text tab, it's actually already figured out. It's already guessed that I'm probably creating a preference screen simply by the name that I've given that file. Now, if you've given it a different name, it may have not populated anything into here yet. The other thing that you may notice is that it's populated this as the Android XML Android namespace. Now, one thing I want to do to make sure I fix things here, especially since you see it saying Android preference screen is deprecated. So I missed a step, basically. I've already missed a step. What I need to do is I need to go into my Gradle, my application Gradle, and add a dependency. Okay, so if we were looking at that settings tutorial that we saw, I kind of showed you at the end of the theory portion, you will have that dependency that you need. Otherwise, you may need to look it up. So if I go look up Android developers settings, that should bring up the article that I'm looking for. There it is. So it's a settings guide. Okay. I'll link that in chat here so that you can find that. And here is kind of scrolling down towards the middle. That's the dependency I need. Okay, so I'm going to go into here. I'm going to add a new dependency called implementation. Dash dash. Okay, there we go. So that's the dependency that I'm adding in. I need to sync that to make sure it gets up to date with that new dependency and downloads it and installs it. And now I'm going to go back to preferences XML. And what you'll see is that message now about it being deprecated is gone. And what's happened really is it switched from using the core Android preferences class for that preference screen to the Android X preferences class for that dependency, which that one is not deprecated. The Jetpack preference screen class is not deprecated. The Android preference, the core one in the SDK is though now. So that's what makes that error message go away. Okay. Now that we've added that in, we can come back and we can start actually building that screen. Okay. So I'm going to go in here. You can kind of see I've got it set up there, and we need to start adding some attributes. So we've got a text tab, we've got a design tab, same way that we're familiar with working with layouts. I'm going to go over the design tab, and I'm going to add in a new preference. So I've got common, preferences, groups. Groups has got that category. I want to switch here. So I'm going to drag in a switch preference. Okay. And I'm going to start setting some of those values over on the right using the designers you're kind of familiar with. Now, the thing to remember as we're working with this is a designer for a preference screen. This is not a designer for a layout. So while it does look very similar, there's a lot in common between this and the layout designer. This is just, there are a few kind of nuances maybe with how this works because we're designing preferences or not designing views. So the default value, according to this, we want to set this to true. So I'm going to check that box, check it twice, and now it's by default it's on. The key for this we want to be example switch. Example switch. The title is settings option. And the summary is turn this option on or off. Okay, so I've made those configure. I need to hit enter to save that. There we go. So now it's popped underneath. So you can kind of see all the settings that I've just put. They're showing up in the designer. By default, it's set. It's got the title, it's got the summary. What you can see over here is it's showing that title. If I go and look at the text tab, we can see all of the XML that's generated. So I can see I've got a switch preference, and I can see what the default value is. I can see the key, I can see the summary, I can see the title. So you can either design this completely in XML, or you can design it completely using the designer. That's really up to you. Whatever you find is the easier workflow. You can do it from the code, or you can start it from the graphical side. Both really work fine. Now, the one thing you will find easier to do in the code side, rather than the designer side, and this is the same way that layouts work, notice that right now this text here is hard-coded, right? So it's not translatable. I put it in the preference XML directly this way. It's not pulling it from a string resource. So the next thing we want to do is extract both of those strings. So here I'm going to extract this text. I'm going to do I'll enter. I'm going to hit extract string resource, and we're going to call this switch title. Oh, nope, that's the summary. Switch summary. Okay. And this is the title. So Alt Enter, extract, switch title. Okay, so now that both of those two things are extracted, there's not really anything much different. Let's see if I can zoom in a little bit. Okay. So that's the code I have there. We kind of talked about what that code means. So the next thing I need to do, it's actually the next thing it's asking me to do is add that dependency. We already added the Jetpack dependency, if you remember right. That was for the preferences over here, Android X preferences. So I'm going to completely skip this step here, because this would be loading the old preferences. See, support v7. This would be the version 7 support libraries. I don't want that. I want the new Android X. So rather than bringing in this dependency, I'm going to bring in this dependency right here, which I've already done. Okay. So kind of going down here, they ask you to use the switch preference compat control here. That was needed with the old library, potentially with the old compatibility library. You don't need to do that anymore with the new Android X library. So this is we're going to leave this just as switch preference. We are not going to change this over to switch preference compat. Again, you needed to do that with the old version 7 library, but you don't need to do that anymore with the switch to the Jetpack, the Android X library. So we're going to leave that there. The next thing that they also ask you to do is going into Styles XML and change this theme. From everything I can tell, this isn't required either. So you used to have to change the theme to support these references screens, but you don't need to change that. That was largely due to how all the compatibility worked with working with older versions, especially Android 1.0 and 2.0 devices. 2.0, 3.0 devices, we don't need to do that anymore. So we don't need to set this preference theme. We don't need to switch that over to switch preference compat. We're going to just leave it as this. Okay. So now the next thing, now that we've built that preferences XML file, I need to go build the activity. Okay. So I'm going to go over to project and go back into Java, expand this folder, and I'm going to create a new empty activity. So new activity, empty activity. When we come down to task 2, we'll look at the settings activity, but for right now, we just want to create it as an empty activity. Okay. So I'm going to do settings activity. Okay, make sure we call it settings. I'm actually going to uncheck generate layout file. Normally we leave that checked because we do want a layout file for our activities, but in this case we don't actually want that layout file, so I'm going to uncheck that box. Okay, I'm going to hit finish. Okay, we do want to add that to Git. So it's created a basic activity here. Notice that there is no layout for it. So if I look at the layout folder here in the resources, I'm going to see that there's no activity settings like you might normally have. Okay, that's not a problem. That's actually how we want it to be. And then I'm going to go, let's see. So I've got that. Yep. And then we need to add the fragment. Okay. Now, the fragment I could add as a separate class, but the current recommendation now is to actually add that fragment inside of this class as a nested class. And then when we generate that through the settings activity, the template, that's actually how it generates it as well. So that's how I'm going to do this. Rather than creating a separate file, rather than creating a separate settings fragment, I'm going to just build it in here. So let's go with that. Public class extends public settings fragment extends preference fragment compat. That's the one I want. And to just double check that you have the correct one, this import should definitely say androidx.preference fragment compat. If that says support, hold up, you don't have the right dependencies. So if you got a different one here, you will need to go back to your Gradle, remove that legacy dependency, and add this dependency here, and then come back, remove the import, try it again. If you didn't get your dependencies right, you'll get that legacy one from the support v7 instead of getting the new one, and that will break things in a minute if you don't have the Jetpack version. Okay, so we'll kind of see that this is red highlighted. I need to do Alt-Enter. I'm going to tell it to implement those methods because I'm missing the onCreate preference method. Now, this is the method I need to implement. If I had created this as a separate class, separate fragment, it would have kind of generated it this way. So it would have generated it with constructor. It would have generated it with this onCreateView method. But I really want to remove both of those two things. Now, by just starting to code it in here as a nested class, it didn't automatically generate those things, so I'm not having to remove them. But if I did create this as a separate fragment class, I would have to go through that. Because I definitely don't want that constructor, and I don't want, well, having the constructor is okay. I could actually just put that in there. That's fine. I don't need the constructor, but having it is not really a problem. But having onCreateView would be a problem. So now inside of onCreate preferences, I'm going to add this method here. Where is it? Okay. Yeah, no, I don't need to do that yet. Skipping on down. Here we go. Okay. So I need to associate this fragment with my preferences XML file that I already created. So I'm going to call set preferences from resource. I'm going to access r.xml.preferences. So that's going to be the ID. And remember, with resources, you're always going to start with R, and then that second part is basically what folder it is in the hierarchy of resources. So we can see this is in the XML folder, and then it's called, the file is called preferences, which is where it gets that name. But we leave the extension off just as we normally would. So, second parameter, root key. Okay, nothing really magical about that. We're good. Okay, so that's my whole settings fragment. That's all I need for that. I don't have to have anything else to get this set up. Okay. However, I still need to tie my settings fragment together with my settings activity, because right now if I go to the settings activity, it'll still be blank. There still won't be anything there. So I'm going to pull in this bit of code here, which is going to display that settings fragment. I'm going to just reformat it a little bit to make it more readable. So we're going to say get support manager, begin the transaction, replace what's there in the middle, and then commit that transaction. Okay. Same code we saw on the slides. Really doesn't change any. This is just what we have. So that replaces everything that's in the content with the fragment. So the fragment's the only thing we're showing here. All right. That's all good. We've got that part. So we're on step 1.7. Okay. So one more thing I need to do before I leave the settings activity. Okay. With nested classes, your nested class automatically gets a reference. I think it's keeping this on a per tab or per file basis, my zoom level. So I may have to keep zooming in. I think with nested classes, by default there's a reference to the class that you're in. So this settings fragment automatically kind of has a reference to the settings activity. And usually that's something I want with a nested class. But in this case, I don't really need it, and it potentially could cause issues with garbage collection and sort of things, because, okay, now they're referring to each other, and that means that the settings fragment is kind of keeping the settings activity alive and vice versa. So I don't want to have that reference because I'm not using it. So I'm actually going to make this a public static class. Okay. And that static class means that this settings fragment class behaves just as if it was its own separate file. It doesn't get any special rules or special treatment because it's inside of my settings activity. It's treated as just as if it was a separate file. The only upside of doing it then here, of having it here, is that I'm just not spreading this logic over maybe 3 or 4 or 5 different files. So it's more contained, even though I'm not necessarily needing that benefit or using that benefit of having them be separate or having them be nested classes. So I need to make sure that that static keyword is there, just from a garbage collection standpoint. Okay. Now that we've created the settings activity, there's still no way to get to it. So that's the last kind of piece of this I need to put in. which is 1.7. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to main activity. So we were on settings activity. I'm going to go back to main activity, and I'm going to look for the on option items selected method. Okay. Now we can see in here there's already a little bit of code that's been written. It's already saying, okay, let's get the menu item ID, and then saying, okay, if it is settings, then let's go do something, and then return true. Otherwise that. So here's where I need to go ahead and add in my logic. So in here, I'm going to create an intent. And I need this and settings activity .class. And then I'm going to call start activity with that intent. You can easily enough do that in one line or two. That's really up to you as far as what the context is, which is really easier to read. A lot of times if it's a simple explicit intent like this, I find it easier rather than writing it out as 2 lines. I usually find it easier to write it out and read it as just 1 line. So usually I'm just going to write a simple explicit intent start activity this way, just as 1 line. So start activity, new intent, pass in the context, which is the activity, and say, well, we want to send it to settings activity. Okay. All right. I'm going to pull up my emulator and let's see if this works. Okay. So go to settings. There we go. Okay. So if I click on settings, I'm going to go in here, and I can switch this back and forth. And if, let's say, I say turn it off, I leave, I come back to settings, it's still off. Let me turn it on and leave and come back. So you can see it's preserved. And in fact, it's preserved to the point where, let's say I turn it off. I'm going to shut down what I have here and come back into the app. Let's go to settings, and you can see it's still off. So whatever setting I put that into, that's preserved even if the app shut down and even if the device were to reboot, which is one of those big things that's different than what we've covered previously before lesson 9. We didn't have a way to save things long term so that they would still be there even if you left the app and came back. So that's solved. Okay. Now there is still a little bit of a still a bit of a hiccup that we do need to fix. But let's go ahead and look at what we have here. So one thing that we'll see, we'll notice on this settings screen. First of all, the title isn't settings. That's one thing we probably want to fix. But we'll also know that there's no up arrow, right? There's no way to go back to main activity, which I normally would expect with a child activity. So I need to go back and fix that. All right, so I'm going to go to the manifest. We're going to add in the properties to make that a child activity. So under settings activity, I need to add a few things. So first we're going to change the label. Android label is settings. I'm going to go ahead and use string action settings because I already know that that is set to settings. And I'm going to set the parent activity name to .settings activity. I'm going to add in that metadata tag here. So that's going to get the up arrow working, so that when we kind of leave this, when that appears, and when we leave this, then we go back to the main activity. Okay, this actually should be main activity, not parent activity. So when I leave that, now one thing I might want to mention here, you'll notice that everything in this file, everything in the application tag is currently yellow. There's some warnings that are on by default. You can actually turn those off. So if I go to Alt-Enter, I can actually go to here and say I'm going to turn both of these warnings off. One of them has to do with backup, one of them has to do with indexing. If you were going to make an app that you were pushing onto the App Store, you probably would want to change both of those things. But assuming that we're just making an app for local testing, you can add this to make both of those warnings go away, because they don't really matter if you're not going to put them on the App Store. So that's what you want to add to make that not yellow anymore. Which can make it easier to kind of work with this. So that's the main activity. We've put that in there. We've changed the title, changed the label. So I'm going to run it again, and let's just see if our changes had the intended effect. Great, there we go. So it says settings as the title, and then it's got the back arrow. So if we go back, it's good. Now, one thing I might want to mention here, hitting the back arrow, by the way, just in general, hitting this back arrow there, the up arrow, and hitting back navigation here, actually don't do the same thing. So it's something you may have encountered, you may have picked up along the way, but I just want to remind you. So basically, when we're in here, if I hit the back arrow, it's going to call finish on the activity. So the activity is going to be destroyed, and then we'll go back to the previous activity. Now, when I go back, that main activity it's going to call on resume. It's going to call on start and then on resume on that activity that we return to. However, if I hit the back arrow, not only it does finish the settings activity, but it actually also destroys main activity. It actually destroys both of them. So if I hit the up arrow, it's going to call on create back on main activity, whereas if I hit the back arrow, it will not call on create on main activity. You might ask why that's important. Well, I'll show you in a minute. If we want to see what's happening with that setting, it matters. It does matter whether onCreate is called or not. So let's look at what's next here. Okay, so we have the navigation working. I need to add in this line of code. Now you'll notice that they're using Android support v7. We don't want to use Android support v7. We want to use the Jetpack library. We use the Android X library. So I'm going to go to main activity, onCreate. So I'm going to go down to the end of onCreate. I'm going to call preference manager. So by leaving off that namespace there, that package name, it's going to go ahead and suggest to me the correct preference manager. So I'm going to go ahead and enter on that, and then we're going to say set default values. I need to pass in the current context, and then the resource file. So r.xml.preferences false. There we go. So to kind of rehash what we talked about in lecture, what this line here is doing is it's making sure when the app starts that the shared preference file gets initialized, because otherwise it's just going to be in there with no data. There's not going to be any values in there. So I'm not going to get the default values that I configured in my preferences.xml, I'm going to get whatever default I put in the code. And that's where we can have a discrepancy between what is there and what is in our code and what is in our preference XML. Our defaults are. And so Graham, you're asking a question about, should we put this in our application? Yes, we should put this line in our application. I'm going to go through this first using the main activity, and then I think once we finish that, I'll come back and we'll move it over to the application. So I'm going to save that for a minute. I'm going to do it here right now, and then we can fix that in a minute. We can fix that later because it won't be too much code to move. So we've got that 1.9. Okay, there we go. So we're going to define a constant up at the top, and this is to make it easier to track when things change. So public static final. If I need to change the name of the setting for some reason, this will make it easier to track that I have it and that I'm using it. So key preference example switch. I'm just going to copy that from here. But I'm going to put that all on one line. Okay. So I've got a constant which is the name of the name of the setting. And then down in main activity, we're going to read this out and display it. So I need the shared preference object first. So shared pref. I do know that there's a few things here that maybe aren't up to maybe the preferred way of doing things, but I'm going to do it this way first, and then we'll maybe fix things and go back to the best practices. So I'm going to start with kind of trying to be at least close to the tutorial, the way the lab is working out, but then we'll change it. We'll fix things. So I'm going to start here. So preference manager dot get default shared preferences, and then I want to grab the switch. So the switch setting. So shared pref dot get boolean. Now, a more important thing to notice here is what get boolean returns. So get boolean does return a boolean as in lowercase boolean. There's a bit of an error in the code here because they're auto-boxing it into an uppercase boolean object, which is not really something we want to do. So I'm going to use that key pref example switch, and then I'm going to have I need to have the default value. So the default value is going to be false. Oh, yes, I do need to pass in the context here. So this is going to be false. And then I want to show a toast with that. So toast dot make text. This, I want to show a true false value. So I'm going to have it say on for true and false and off for false. So I'm going to say, I need to save this in a variable. So boolean switch pref. Okay, so we're going to have the switch pref, and I'm going to use a little ternary to turn it into a string. So if it's true, we're going to display on. If it's false, we're going to display off. Toast dot length long dot show. Okay. So that code's all in there. Let's try it out. Okay. So we start it and run it. It says off. I'm going to go change the setting. I'm going to switch it on. I'm going to come back. Okay. So it's on. It showed on. Now, I did mention that there was kind of a difference in the life cycle between hitting the back button versus hitting the up button. So notice that this toast, we're showing this in onCreate. So this code will only run if onCreate is actually called, right? So if I go here and I go back, you can see that the toast does show up. But if I go in here and I hit the back arrow down here on the actual device, notice that the toast doesn't appear, right? So in the case that I push the back button, the toast does not appear because onCreate is not called. But if I click up, the toast does appear. Okay, so I want it to appear in both places. Well, I know that onCreate is only called one way, but I also know that onStart is called both ways. So if I take this code and I move it to onStart, instead of being an onResume, okay, so I'm going to type in onStart, add an onStart method. I'm going to cut this code and move it over to onStart. Okay, so I'm setting the default values. I am doing that process here in onCreate, but I'm going to show the toast over in onStart. So some of the code is in onCreate, some of the code is onStart. This way, it's going to be called through both pathways. So here we get on. Okay, when it starts, hit settings, we'll go back, toast is there. Settings, go back, toast is there. So now I can see that toast either way. Okay. Now that's an error on the part of the lab. They tell you to put that in onCreate. Typically, you don't want to put logic like that in onCreate. Usually, you want to move logic like that into onStart for that very reason. So usually, if you're reading preferences, you probably want to read those preference values in onStart. You probably don't want to read them in onCreate. That's a kind of give and take. There may be cases where that makes sense to do it in onCreate. There are cases where you want to do it in onStart. But I would say by default, most cases, onStart's probably your right answer. But that's not a universal rule. But in a case like this, that's definitely what you want, because otherwise the setting wouldn't be loaded if I came back here. Okay. All right, so we've got that much implemented. Next question. Let me see if we have anything else left in the lab before I go on to changing things up. Yeah, okay. So that's the end of task 1. Okay. So the next thing I want to do, generally speaking, I don't want to ask for the shared preferences object all the time. I don't want to ask for that frequently. I only want to ask for that once. So usually it makes sense to go ahead and save that in some sort of instance variable. So I'm going to say private shared preferences. I'm going to call this M preferences. Now this is the same thing that we did with lesson 9.1. We put that into an instance variable. And I'm going to move this line of code here back into onCreate. So I'm going to say M preferences is equal to get default shared preferences. So I only need to get the shared preference object in onCreate. The thing I need to do on onStart is load the value. Okay, so I'm going to grab get default shared preferences here. I'm going to remove that there, and I'm going to use the member variable then down here. Okay, so that way I'm only calling get default share preferences once when onCreate is called, rather than calling it every time onStart's called, every time I need it. So I can use that M preferences now throughout the rest of the class. So that's general good practice, is to save that into an instance variable so you can reuse it. The other thing you may want to do is look at moving this. Now, before I move that, I do want to show you why it's there. Okay, so first of all, let's comment this out. Okay, so right now, we've already changed the setting, right? So even without this line of code, if I run it, it's going to show on. Okay, it's going to show on. I've told it my default value here is false. My fallback value is false. But I already have a setting set. Okay, so in order to test, in order to make sure that this set default values is working correctly, I actually need to uninstall the app on the device. Okay, there's a few ways to do that. I'm going to go to Home. And then I'm going to go into Settings. Apps and Notifications. There's the app with settings live. Okay. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on that. I'm going to say uninstall. There we go. So now that app is removed. And remember, once I install an app, that deletes all the files that are in internal storage. Well, shared preferences is stored in internal storage, okay, typically. And that means that those settings that we had there are now gone. We're starting from scratch, okay? So the important thing here to remember before I do the next thing is we need to make sure that this is commented out. If that's not commented out, you're not going to see the behavior that I'm looking for in a moment, okay? So we're going to go ahead and run it again. Now we're reinstalling the app. And notice that it says off. Okay? It says off. Well, that means that when I grabbed this value, I tried to get the preference, I got back false. Okay? I got back false. Because I didn't run this line of code, I don't have a shared preference file. There is nothing saved. Okay? So because that key doesn't exist, it's going to fall back and use the false I have here, right? False I have here. Remember, though, that I set the default value to true, okay? So the default should have actually been true, okay? So I have true here. I have my fallback value as false. Those are contradicting each other about what should be the default value. Okay, so this value is getting used because there's no file there. Okay, so when the app runs, I want to make sure that that file gets created so that what's in that file is all of those default settings that I've set up in preferences.xml. So let me put this line back in. So remember, right now when I started it up, it showed off. Okay, if I start it with this line in here, it's going to say on. There we go. See, it says on. But in doing this, it has created that preference file. So if I comment it back out and run it, you can see that it still says on, even though that line's not there. Reason being is it's loading it from the shared preferences that I created the previous time I ran the app. So one of the things that means, if you're testing your app, okay, make sure that one of the things you do in testing it is uninstall the app from the device and then try to run it again. Because when we're working with shared preferences, if you forget to say call this, you're going to see potentially different behavior when you uninstall it and then reinstall it. And you're not going to see that behavior unless you do that. So that's a very good thing to keep in mind. It also means that typically we want to keep these values like this in line with what's in our preferences.xml. So if this says true, then I also really should say true here as my fallback value. Unfortunately, there's not an easy tool to keep those two things in sync. You cannot read from the preferences.xml from code, as far as I know, unless there's something I'm missing. So that means you don't really have a way to retrieve the default value in code and make sure that they're the same. So that's a little bit of a maintenance overhead, unfortunately, to just try and keep that in sync. Now, as long as you have this method being called when your application starts, basically what that does is it doesn't matter whether or not you have this and whether or not have your fallback value and your default value be the same. Because that means that there will always be a value in the file instead of sometimes there not being a value. So that's the workaround that they've introduced there. It's still good to keep them being the same value, but that's why that exists. Now, before we leave this, let's look at briefly how you might move this line into the application class. And it's actually pretty simple. So I'm going to go into there we go, Java. We're going to say new Java class. I'm going to call this just my app. Hit OK. Add. I'm going to say this extends application. I'm going to start implementing the onCreate method. Okay. So this is my application class. I do want to move a few things over here. So first of all, I'm going to move both the constant I have here as well as my shared preference object. I'm going to move both of those things into my application. Okay. So I have my key preference example switch. I have that constant, and I have my preference object here. I'm going to take both of these two methods that I have in onCreate. I'm going to move them over to onCreate here. Okay, so I have a mPreference object. I have that. These two things are now I want them to be initialized when the app starts. I want to use the default values. I want to create that file with the default values, and then I want to have this preference object that I can use. Now, one thing you can do to reduce the maintenance overhead with keeping the default values and the fallback values in line is actually do all of your work with shared preferences in the application class. That helps keep it all in one place. So for instance, I'm going to add a method in here. I'm going to add public boolean get switch pref. And here I'm going to say return preferences dot get boolean. I'm going to use the constant, and I'm going to default it to true. Okay. So now I have this in one place. I can use this throughout my app instead of kind of littering my code with different places where I'm accessing this preference. So if I have this in the application, okay, I only have one place to change if, for instance, the key changes or the default value changes. So that helps. Now that I've moved, however, now that I've moved the code here into the application, I probably need to update the code in the main activity. Okay, so this is my application. One thing I want to do before I leave. Well, let me go ahead and do this, and we'll see where it fails. So I've moved all this code over here. We've got to make sure to remember to mark that public so we can access that method. I'm going to go back to here. I'm actually going to I'm going to comment out both of those lines. Okay. In fact, I don't need either the constant, I don't need the instance variable, I don't need any of those things now. Okay, so my code down here is going to become very simple. Okay, so I need the application first. So I'm going to say my app is equal to get application. And then we'll remember we have to cast that down to our specific instance. So my app there. Okay, and then I'm going to say as the second line app. The second line is going to change to app.get switch preference. So So I'm going to get the switch preference from the application and then display it in a toast. Okay. So we're mostly there. If I run it, we'll see there's maybe a little bit of a problem. Notice it crashed. Okay. So I ran, crashed it. What happened? Well, let's look at logcat. Okay. So logcat, filter down to error, so we're not having as much noise. And let's see what happened. So there's my stack trace. Well, one of them. There we go. So class cast exception, application cannot be cast to my app. And it points us to this line. Well, what get application is returning is just an application object. It's saying I can't cast this application object to my app. I can't downcast it because it actually isn't my app. That's because I've forgotten to do a step, right? So kind of rehashing what we talked about previously, if I create an application subclass, I need to remember to register it in my manifest. Okay, so I need to go back up to my manifest. I'm going to say Android name is my app. Okay, so by adding that Android name, it shouldn't crash when I run it now. There we go. Good. So that's considered, that's how we would do that. That's kind of considered best practice anytime you're working with shared preferences, whether it be with the settings or the preference API. It's still good to ideally move most of that code that's working directly with shared preference into your application, so that you're kind of extracting that out and you're not having those constants everywhere else in your code. Okay. Any questions with that? Or any bugs? Because that should put us at the end of task 1. No, so my app isn't really quote-unquote running in the background. Everything that we have here, the onCreate method, that's still run on the main thread. The catch is that this onCreate gets called before any of your activities or your services start. So it really guarantees that that gets run. It guarantees that this code that I have here will be run even if I'm running automated tests, whether it be basically whether it be unit tests or whether it be any sort of instrumented tests that I run, whether it be instrumented unit tests or espresso tests, that makes sure that this logic happens first, especially if I'm jumping into kind of a deep activity, because I don't have to start at main activity when I'm running espresso or unit tests. That guarantees that this runs, and it also just guarantees that it runs for any services to make sure that that gets set up before the services start. Otherwise, I would end up having to put all the same logic in all of my services and in potentially all my activities, and that would be a nightmare. honestly think that we're probably at a clean breaking point at this point. I know it's about 4:30. I'm going to assume that people probably have other things that they need to do. So I think maybe what I'll do is I'll shut this off here at this point, and then we'll start with, I think I'll do task 2 tomorrow. I don't know what time is going to work best for people to start up with task 2 and such, but I think maybe probably a good place to just call it a day. Again, looking for input. Yeah, so I think that's the plan. We'll resume with task 2 at 12:35 tomorrow. We should be easily able to get the rest of 9.2 done tomorrow. Okay, so I'm gonna sign off. You've got all that code. The replay will obviously be live, and we'll just finish this up at 12:35 tomorrow.